Hey folks, David Stewart here. What I want to talk about today is the terror of childhood isolation and the overwhelming fear and anxiety of childhood loneliness. This is something that I think affects a lot of people that are around my age. The Gen Yers or maybe later Gen Xers, people born in the 70s or 80s. Not really as much for people born after 1990 because by the time you get after 1990, cell phones start to become more of a thing. And so we have a lot of connectivity between each other rather than this kind of isolation. But I think for those of us who grew up in the 80s, this was a really profound feeling. And I put it in this book. It's a really important part of this book because it heightens a lot of the fear that the main character is going through. The main character is a child. So I want you to imagine this. If you were born in the 70s or 80s, you might feel this. And if you weren't, you can imagine this. Is that you get up in the morning, your parents are getting ready for work, you walk yourself to school. You're at school all day, and maybe you walk yourself home and there's no one home. You get your key out of your backpack, you open up the door, and you play Nintendo and avoid doing your homework for a couple hours until your parents get home at like 6. Now, anything could happen after that school bell rings. The parents aren't there, and maybe there's an administrator like in front of the school watching the kindergartners get on the bus, but there are no adults watching the school. After that bell rang at 3 o'clock and the kids started to disperse, the adults never left their classrooms. The teachers weren't out there watching anyone, at least where I grew up, and this seems to be pretty common as well. So how much stuff could happen between that bell ringing and you reaching your doorstep? And the answer is a lot, and if you were, say, like an 8 or 9-year-old kid and you went to school with 12-year-olds, they could bully you if they wanted to, and there was no one watching to protect you. Your parents weren't there to pick you up in most cases, and your teachers weren't watching it happen. And if you went to a teacher, you went to an administrator and said, "Hey, this kid beat me up," and so maybe they do something about it, but they don't watch the next time. So things happen 10 times worse than they happened before. So the bigger kid comes and beats you up even worse. In fact, they had this in a Simpsons episode. Why don't you tell the teachers that Nelson's bullying you? Because he'll just beat me up even more. It's like, of course he will. That's the way bullying works. And it probably was similar to this for even, older generations. I think maybe it's a little safer for newer generations, having been a teacher and seen, a lot of response to some of these issues over the last, say, 20 years. But I think older generations, that may be true as well. However, they were going home to intact families. So if you were 70s or 80s, the next big thing that happened is that increased your isolation is divorce. Lots of families were divorced. My family is not divorced, but I'd say at least half my friends had divorced families, or they only lived with one parent. But even then, you don't live just with one parent. So I had lots of friends that they lived with their mom Monday through Friday, and then they lived with their dad Saturday and Sunday. So they didn't really have a home. Like, what was their home? Their room. They had 2 rooms. They had a home kind of with their mom, and they kind of stayed with their dad. They had different stuff in each place. And of course, their parents weren't a unified force supporting them. You could change what information each parent had. Parents had different information on each other, different relationships with each other. You had step parents. You had this complex, overly complex family life that also at the same time was atomized as far as the extended family goes. I didn't really know any of my cousins growing up, for instance, or I spent very, very little time with them, even the ones that were in the same state, whereas I knew other people that grew up with all their cousins. So if you have a nuclear family that then becomes a broken family, think about how isolated you are from any kind of adult or any kind of somebody who's supposed to protect you actually looking over for you. So this was a big feeling in the 80s. And I talked to so many people that were born in the 70s. If you grew up in the 80s in particular, you may have felt this, that you were just kind of alone and you were just kind of adrift. There was really no one protecting you. And this was a big theme in this book, Eyes in the Walls, that Billy, the main character, comes to this conclusion that no one's going to help him. Nobody can protect him. He has to protect himself. He has to resolve the conflict in the book himself. Adults are not going to believe him. And in fact, adults are going to actively hinder him from being able to resolve this because the adults think he's crazy. And so this is another thing. This is the third thing, which is the response towards children's problems was always that there was a problem with the child. And medication was a big one. So towards the end of the 80s and going into the 90s, we start to have this, I don't know, epidemic is the wrong word because this thing didn't really exist, but ADD and ADHD, where kids were misbehaving in school. They weren't being diligent little work rats at their desks, and they were being disruptive. And so the solution was not to change your discipline schedule for the kid or reinforce the behavior that you wanted. It was to medicate the child. It was to take the child to a doctor and have the doctor say, well, there's something wrong with your child. He has ADD, he has ADD, or he has ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and we're going to give him some medicine for that will help him focus on his school tasks. And the medicine that you would give your child would actually be, in some cases, quite potent, like Disoxin, which is just methamphetamine. So you'd be giving a child methamphetamine in order to change his behavior so he was more tolerant of the school situation. And of course, the school situation, most of us didn't enjoy school. School was a place of torment or a place of extreme boredom and a little bit of fun maybe at recess, right? So it was not a place that people enjoyed. So you medicate your kid to make the kid adjust to a world which he doesn't fit into and which is bad to him. And so that's a theme in Eyes on the Walls as well, because when Billy sees this monster, his parents' reaction or his mother's reaction after he gets in trouble is to take him to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist, and really not unreasonably considering what's there, diagnoses him with early onset schizophrenia and views this vision of the monster and this belief that the monster's coming to like attack him at night as delusions and hallucinations related to a mental disorder, to a mental disease, and medicates him really probably appropriately for that. But I chose that because it was just a concentrated dose of the feelings from my childhood, which is that the response to something being wrong is that there's something wrong with the child. Medicating, like I wasn't medicated really, but most, and I wouldn't say most, lots of my friends were. And they grew up and they said, I don't really believe in any of that. My parents, I just hated school. And so my parents had a response called, you have to take your Ritalin. You got to take your medicine. Now I knew kids that faked taking their medicine. So they would pretend to take the pill and spit it out because they didn't like the way it made them feel. And their parents were trying to force that on them. They didn't feel like themselves. And they understood that there was something wrong with making your kid take psychotropic medicine in order to adjust his mood so that he's more tolerant of school. So that's another big one too, is that that approach. But that, again, it increases the distance between child and adult, between child and caregiver, child and parent, to where the parent is a somewhat hostile force. You don't want to confide in them. You don't want them to help you with anything because their response is going to be against you. And so this is, I encountered that many times with teachers for various things. If you said, this isn't, so-and-so is being bad to you, it's like, okay, well, why haven't you fixed that? What's wrong with you? It's like, okay, well, I went to you because I felt like I couldn't fix it. So those are a lot of the things that were part of my childhood growing up and the childhood of lots of people I feel like around my age. And that is the time period in which this book here, Eyes on the Wall, actually takes place. It takes place in about 1989, and you can kind of clue in to where that is. The kid is still reading comics. There's still horror comics on the shelves. Once we get into the 1990s, the comics landscape really changes, and the customers for comics change. But he has a Game Boy, which is a brand new device in 1989. This handheld gaming device that his dad buys him so he could play video games. Now, you had this rich childhood of like expensive toys, but you didn't have like a firm house that you lived in. And so Billy's experiencing that. His parents are divorced, so he spends part of the time with his mom, part of the time with his dad. He has different feelings towards each of them, but neither place is really home. One feels very unsafe, and the other one feels like a a safer place, but not home. So you never have that grounded feeling of security as a child. And that's what I really wanted to get across. There was an insecure feeling for lots of people around that age. We were just kind of doing our own thing. Once you get older and you get cell phones, then it's too connected. You start to have hyper connectivity where you're always a phone call away from your mom or dad, or especially if you're born after 1990 and you're getting into like social media territory as a teen and as even a kid, where you're really connected to friends, you're really connected to adults. Adults are more aware of problems like bullying, and so there's just way less childhood isolation. That's the feeling that I really wanted to go for this story, because I think it heightens the terror. The feeling of being all alone as a child is awful. And children also, their lives can feel dangerous as a child. The shadows could be, you don't have a whole lot of life experience to know what danger is there. The shadows could be anything around you. Somebody could hurt you. You're very physically vulnerable. You're not strong enough to fight for yourself. You're not strong enough to protect yourself. And so when you are in the absence of protection, you feel highly vulnerable as a child. And that's going to be true for any generation, for sure. But I think it's of special importance for those around my age because of that heightened feeling of isolation due to failed institutions like school, where the school was no longer really functioning, and also marriages breaking up, communities breaking down, but without transitioning to the more hyper-connected place that we have now, where everybody is very connected through social media and things like that. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. You can get Eyes in the Walls on December 13th. That's Friday the 13th in December. And read it and let me know. Make sure you're on my mailing list, dbspress.com/list for the advanced copies. And I will have those coming out here at some point. And leave me your thoughts down below about how you felt about childhood, particularly if you grew up in the 70s or 80s, because I feel like this is a common experience. I keep talking to people, and this is really how it felt. And if you grew up after that, what was your experience too? Did you feel unparented but still really connected, or did you feel like your parents were more connected to you, like your parents were always vigilant about you, even if maybe they were divorced or something? So I'd like to know some other people's experiences that are maybe a little bit younger than me too. So thanks so much, and I will see you guys next time.